forget the moment I met you, the moment you called my name, pulled me out of the darkness, gave me a promise to never thirst again. And all that I ever wanted, my heart has found in you. I have tasted life, and nothing satisfies like you do. The fount that won't run dry, nothing satisfies like you do. Satisfies like you do. The fount that won't run dry, nothing satisfies like you do.
Dearest Jesus, thank you for bringing us to this time of prayer, to listen to your word. Help us to go deep with you tonight and let you lead us where you wish us to go. Good evening, everyone. As Letty said, for those of you who are new or relatively new to our School of the Word, my name is Des, and I'm a missionary disciple of Verbum Dei. So welcome to our third session in our Lenten series. So we've pretty much reached the midway point, right, of our Lenten journey. Our series started, 2 weeks ago with Letty sharing that Lent is a time of grace, and grace means gift. So Lent is a time to receive gifts of grace, and indeed it is. When we're loved, there is so much grace showered upon us. If only we knew. But we don't always know, because it's difficult to receive when we are already so full of so many other things. And so, like what Maria Jose shared last week in our second session, we empty ourselves, not to remain empty, but to be filled with God's word, right? And for what purpose? For the purpose of being able to live out the identity that we already know in our heads, but that we sometimes doubt in our hearts, and we oftentimes fail to live out in our lives, right? Our identity is God's precious child, but with our own unique path. That's the purpose. In fact, if there is such a thing as the goal or endpoint for our Lenten journey, it is to journey to the heart of Jesus. I love how one of my favorite poets, Khalil Gibran, puts it. When you love, you should not say, God is in my heart, but rather, I am in the heart of God. Because that is where our journey should ideally take us, to the absolute security of knowing that I am God's precious child and that I live in his heart. And the reason we find it hard to believe sometimes and often harder to live is because we carry so many unnecessary burdens that feed our fears and cause us to question or even choose to give our other identities first place. And so tonight, we're actually going to journey with the Samaritan woman at the well and see how she allowed herself to be emptied of her burdens and became filled with the living water that Jesus had to offer. And like the Samaritan woman, this is what Jesus wants to offer us as well, to remove our burdens that feed our fears and fill us with this living water. Now let's turn to the story of the Samaritan woman, because I find her experience very apt for us. And you're all probably familiar with this story since you heard it just this past weekend, right? It was the gospel passage for the third Sunday of Lent. So here we have the Samaritan woman who was heavily burdened. Now, unlike, the stories of the Old Testament, like the Jews, right? They were physically starving and thirsty, right? It was a very physical thirst, living in the desert. But the Samaritan woman's burdens are invisible to the eye, just like so many of us. She was a social outcast because she had 5 husbands. And if that isn't in itself already a painful burden, she also lived with the burden of not knowing how to get out of that vicious cycle and finding herself in the same situation again and again, finding herself unable to choose otherwise, and so just having to live with the consequences and make the best of it. And I say her burden is invisible because it's easy to look at it from an outsider's perspective and say, well, she only has herself to blame because she chose to marry 5 times, right? But for anyone who's ever found themselves trapped within a vicious cycle of any kind within themselves, it's a very painful experience and one that's terribly lonely because it's not easy to get empathy for that. So many of the burdens are all the more harder to bear because they are hard to talk about, to even define, and much more. And they are often invisible not only to the people who see us, but invisible also to ourselves. Yet they have powerful consequences on our identity and our self-worth. And it's likely that this Samaritan woman had very low self-worth. We can see that the way she chose to go to the well when the noonday sun was at its hottest, she chose this time knowing that likely no one else would be there and she wouldn't have to interact or feel judged by anyone. But to make the situation worse, she also had other burdens. Now, when she met Jesus at the well and he asked her for a drink of water, how did she respond? She responded by saying, "How can you, a Jew, ask for water? This is prejudice or misconception, and these two are burdens." Now, she's not to blame for this since her society taught her this, right? But blame isn't the point. The point is, it's a burden, a dead weight in her life. And you can tell a burden, you can tell that something is a burden when it takes away life, as opposed to maybe something like a responsibility, which usually does bring life, even though it's still not easy to bear, right? But we can see in her interaction with Jesus that even though she might have the desire and perhaps, under other circumstances, the compassion to want to give a thirsty man a drink, her prejudice and perhaps even suspicion about why Jesus is talking to her and asking her, a Samaritan, for a drink, this created a barrier between her and Jesus. And the saddest thing is, when you go in and read the passage closely, even though she has this jar of water, right? Or this jar of water that she can fill with at the well, she never actually gives Jesus a drink. She has the capacity to give him a drink, yet is never able to exercise that capacity on her own because of the burden she bears. And how true is that for so many of us, right? Left to depend only on ourselves, we might actually have good intentions, but our own jars are never enough to feed the real need that exists within us and around us. We either find ourselves without the capacity to properly give, or we find that having given something, it didn't actually address the real need or the real thirst. And Jesus actually confirms this when he tells her, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. It's not just some people, but everyone we try to feed with our own jar, including ourselves, will be thirsty again. The burdens we bear, such as the mistaken beliefs we carry in life, often create walls that keep us from answering real needs. And I find myself in this situation so often, probably with every person I've ever cared about, right? So as an example, sometime last year, when COVID measures began to ease up, I started bringing my 8-year-old nephew to the playground, right, at the park. And I observed how he interacted with the other kids. He would often annoy them in small ways, and they would get mad and retaliate. And then my nephew would get angry and then later say he was being bullied. And that's how my eyes saw it, right? My eyes saw him as the culprit starting to annoy others. And therefore, I concluded that he couldn't really blame them for retaliating. That was me applying my standards, right? My vision. Now, the first few times when he spoke to me and complained to me about it, I wanted to help him. But my way of helping him was to try to tell him what he was doing wrong. I was trying to tell him he shouldn't do this and that to annoy the other kids, that they wouldn't want to play with him or be his friend, right? Or they would retaliate if he kept on doing what he was doing. Now, my intentions were all good, or mostly good. I wanted him to develop good social skills in life so he could make friends. But after a few times of me trying to teach him, one day he just stopped sharing with me. He'd just go silent. And I knew that somehow, despite my best intentions, I had messed up. That the jar I had tried to feed him from was my own jar that came from my eyes, my conclusions, my assumptions on the situation and what was needed. And in a way, that's where the Samaritan woman was, right? Burdened in so many ways. But Jesus, seeing this, seeing her internal struggle and burden, enters into a deeper encounter with her. And it's actually this process that Jesus undertakes, which ultimately allows her to become unburdened. And so how does he do this? Well, he does this with 3 powerful weapons of love. And I use the word weapon very deliberately because these help us fight our interior battles. And the first of these was that Jesus gives her the truth. Jesus speaks truth to her. He tells her the truth of what her real need is and the truth of who he is, even if she doesn't completely comprehend it at the moment. He says, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water that I shall give will never thirst. The water I shall give will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." And sometimes we might think, why would she trust the words of this man she just met? And a Jewish man at that, right? The enemy of her people. But you see, the funny thing about truth is, and by this I mean God's truth, that God's truth is such a powerful thing that when heard, it resonates with something deep inside us. We can choose to ignore it and continue to follow our own path. But because we are born in God's image and likeness, his truth already exists as a blueprint inside of us. We're not born blank slates. The letter to the Hebrews says, "I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts." And God doesn't just mean the 10 commandments or the do's and don'ts, but all truth, the truth of love, the truth of our real needs, the truth of how to love and how to be loved is already in our minds and written in our hearts. So when the Samaritan woman hears this, it resonates with something inside her. And then what does Jesus do? Jesus moves from sharing the truth about himself and her need to the truth about her and her burdens. The one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true. That's what he says. And that's how encounter with Jesus first tries to share something about himself, right? And then through his word, and then wants to show us that he also cares about our situation and understands us. That's what a relationship is. It's not just about us, nor is it just about Jesus, but both, right? And more importantly, the truth that Jesus speaks is balanced with the second weapon of love, compassion. He didn't condemn her, and neither did he try to make her feel better by reassuring her with an untruth. He never tried to make her feel better by letting her think that her situation was justified and acceptable, right? As sometimes we might be tempted to do if we feel sorry. And that's the power of Jesus' love, right? That power to help her unburden herself. It is truth with compassion. Because truth without compassion can do great damage and drive someone away. However, compassion with truth can lead one astray. But together it is life-changing. It gives courage and it opens us up to receive the graces, right? These graces Letty spoke of a few weeks ago, to let go of what we need to let go of and to transform. And Jesus goes one step further. He gives her one more thing, this third weapon of love, hope. He uses hope in part to also take apart her prejudices about Jews versus Samaritans. He says to her, "The hour is coming and is here now when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. And indeed, the Father seeks such people to worship him." Now, she who belonged to a discriminated people would no longer be defined by the society she was born into, but would have the same opportunity as anyone else to become a true worshiper, to know that she too is being sought out by the Father, right? Now, I know oftentimes, the Bible isn't very romantic in its language. And so sometimes when we read this line, it doesn't sound like a big deal. But imagine to a person who is an outcast from a society that is looked down upon, and the way they worship is seen as false or second class. Those are words of hope, real hope. And to know that the God that you worship is also out. How assuring and personal is that affirmation, right? Was that affirmation for her? I sometimes feel that the courage to listen to Jesus' truth, that specific truth that he wants to speak to our lives, makes it one of the hardest parts of building a relationship with Jesus. We always want his compassion and hope, but we don't always want his truth. Yet all these three things are required to truly empty ourselves out so that we can be filled not with our own water, but his living water. And again, I want to quote from the poem I read earlier, right, that describes love. Even as love ascends to your height and caresses your tenderest branches, so shall love descend to your roots and shake them in their clinging to the earth. And that's exactly what God's truth does. It shakes all our false beliefs, false assumptions, misconceptions of life, of others, of ourselves. These things that are so deeply rooted in us, that burden us and keep us from growing into who we truly are. And that's what Jesus did with the Samaritan woman. And we see how life-changing it was for her. Because after that, she had the courage to leave her jar behind. She left her jar by that well in exchange for the living water. She no longer needed a jar because Jesus' truth assured her that his water was now a spring inside her, right? Inside her, she would always have access to it. And not only was she able to leave this jar, right? This jar that represents her complete self-dependency and isolation and burdens, but she was now able to enter back into community, into her society, and be unafraid to speak, be unafraid to share the very thing that used to condemn her, because she goes back and she proclaims to everyone, he told me everything I have done. And what's amazing is that, at this point, nothing externally had actually changed in her life, at least not at this point when she rushed back to speak. She still had that current sixth partner that she was with. Yet, from someone who was a social outcast, from an isolated woman of low self-worth, she becomes the source of new hope, speaking and feeding the people from the living water that was now inside her, right? The living water that was her relationship with Jesus, his truth, his compassion, his hope. So I kind of ended my personal story halfway earlier, right? And some of you might be wondering what happened in my relationship with my nephew, or you might not, but I'm going to tell you anyway. So I was obviously really distraught and burdened by this, and I felt trapped. On the one hand, I wanted him to trust me, but on the other hand, I wanted to teach him because I genuinely feared for him, right? So perplexed, I prayed. Right? I prayed about it, and then I waited. And then one day, actually pretty quickly after, a friend of mine who I hadn't seen in years called me to lunch. And to my great surprise, somehow ended up sharing with me a similar experience he had with his daughter, right? How uncanny. I had goosebumps, right? He said that he had changed from trying to teach his daughter, what he thought, to just asking her about her day and how she saw her own situation. And then he just listened, So I went back and I tried it week after week. At first, for a long time, my nephew, he continued to say very little. nothing of substance. I could tell he was deflecting my questions by giving the bare minimum answer, right? And really, I honestly almost gave up, right? But I persisted. And one day, when I was driving us home from the park again, he turned and said to me, "Auntie, how do I stop myself from getting angry when the other kids make me angry?" That was breakthrough. I knew something had changed in our dynamic, that he had asked me such a question. And I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but I was so overwhelmed. I really treaded that conversation with the utmost care, right? That to me, that was the gift of Jesus' living water, right? Because it gave life both to my nephew and I. And it helped me realize that at that stage in my relationship with my nephew, him being able to trust me was more important than anything else. And so in this time of prayer, and not just in this time of prayer, but in all your times of prayer, allow God to speak his truth to you, to your life and to your specific situation. And I don't mean just God's general truth, because we take a lot of general truths and apply it as and how we like sometimes. But ask God to show you the truth that he wants to speak to you specifically, the truth that unburdens you and brings life to you and those in your life. And it's okay to feel cautious and uncomfortable, as the Samaritan woman likely did, and as I often do when I have such, vulnerable discussions with God. But don't run away, because God will always speak his truth with compassion and hope, right? For I know well the plans I have in mind for you, plans for your welfare and not for your woe, so as to give you a future of hope. When you look for me, you will find me. Yes, when you seek me with all your heart, I will let you find me and I will change your lot. So take this opportunity to go deep. Perhaps read the passage slowly and pause at what strikes you, even if it's just a subtle thing, a word or a phrase that pops out or doesn't make sense or makes you curious. Trust the Holy Spirit takes charge of your prayer. Or you might have a question, a concern, or anxiety in your mind. Bring that to Jesus. Then read the passages and let him speak through his word. Let his word speak truth to your life and trust. As the letter to the Corinthians says, that love rejoices with the truth. So we'll have about 20 minutes, as Letty said, and I'm going to show the passages so you can turn your screens off, and we'll come back to this space after for our communitarian prayer.